Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. Thanks so much for listening. I want to give a quick heads up that in November, so looking way ahead, we are hoping to have two different events at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature in San Diego. So be on the lookout in the next few months as we get information together for those events. And any other events we have coming up, we'll keep you posted on. But thanks so much for listening. And to those of you who support the podcast, we really appreciate it.
Well, welcome to another episode of OnScript. Today, it's a real privilege to introduce Austin Stevenson, author of The Consciousness of the Historical Jesus, Historiography, Theology, and Metaphysics. I've really enjoyed wrestling with this book over the last few weeks, and I guarantee there is a lot to chew over here, an awful lot to learn from, and I'm very much looking forward to this chat. Let me welcome our guest, Austin Stevenson. Welcome to this episode.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here.
Well, Dr. Austin Stevenson, you're assistant professor of theology at Palm Beach Atlantic University, and co-host of the Faith at the Frontiers podcast, and I'm sure many of our listeners frequent that. He and his wife, Catherine, grew up in Wyoming, and they spent the last 10 years living in Canada and the UK. Sadly, we were just talking before the show began. Sadly, we didn't manage to meet up when he was in the UK. But before joining the faculty at Palm Beach Atlantic, Austin was a junior research fellow at Pembroke College, Oxford. He holds an MA and THM in theology from Regent College and a PhD from the University of Cambridge. So a lot of big names there, Oxbridge material. His research specializes in the ressourcement of classical Christian thought in conversation with an interdisciplinary range of topics, including theological hermeneutics, New Testament studies, public health, literature, and the natural sciences. Now, I've got to say, those subjects are dear to my heart as well. So I've learned a lot from you, and I'm sure our listeners will too. But maybe you can just tell us a little bit about your book, The Consciousness of the Historical Jesus. What prompted you to write about this subject? Is there a story behind the book?
There is a story, yes, a long story behind the book. I think the short version of it, around 10 years ago now, I was at Regent College in Vancouver, and in a New Testament class, we were assigned Tom Wright's book, The New Testament and the People of God. And I devoured that. I loved it, as many of us did. And then immediately I bought the rest of the books in the series that had been published to that point. And I was reading Jesus and the Victory of God. And right near the end, N.T. Wright says, Jesus didn't know he was God. And I circled that and put a big question mark next to it and thought, I have no idea what to do with this. But it seems significant and maybe questionable. I have no idea. I don't know. And so then in all of my classes from then on, when anytime we kind of tangentially came close to those questions, I would ask the professor that question. Did Jesus know he was God? What do you think about this? And I got a whole range of answers that made me realize that there were deep kind of methodological questions underlying that question for me. And so that was sort of continued through me wrestling then pretty deeply with questions about the relationship between biblical scholarship and systematic theology. I was kind of in a theology program, but was really, really interested in historical biblical scholarship. And these questions of hermeneutics I was really wrestling with. And then at the same time, I was coming from a background of largely studying Karl Barth. I was very Barthian. All of my research was very, very much Barth. He's what got me interested into theology. But I was asking these questions about the relationship between philosophy and theology, about the possible role of metaphysics, and I was becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the Barthian approach. And all of those then converged on Aquinas for me at one point, and in part because my professor Hans Boersma said, Aquinas has some interesting stuff to say about Jesus knowledge. Maybe that'd be a place to look to think about this question. And so Aquinas is largely someone who I had avoided for a lot of my theological studies, but that kind of all coalesced into this project, which began then as a THM thesis and then a PhD eventually.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, I loved these two lines, really from very different ends of your book. I just wanted to read these out. This is from page 206. You say, claims about what Jesus did or did not know are not theologically neutral, nor do they stem from genuinely historical arguments. Rather, they are assumed on the basis of pre-commitments to alternative metaphysical and theological frameworks. And then there's this one from page 5. Chalcedonian Christology should make us more interested in history, not less. Now, both of these quotes, in many ways, I thought got to the heart of what you were arguing. But maybe big picture now, nutshell, what is your main thesis?
So the main thesis for the book, I think there's levels to the thesis. So at the broadest level, my argument is that I'm interested in asking what counts as a historical perspective when it comes to Jesus and why. And so within that, I argue that classical Christology and historical Jesus studies should be characterized as rival traditions of historical inquiry. And that essentially means there's two tasks, which I think are captured well by those quotes that you've pulled out. On the one hand, to show that the methods and conclusions of historical Jesus scholarship are impacted by implicit metaphysical and even theological assumptions that aren't neutral and aren't adequately defended. And that particularly, I focus on questions of knowledge, right? So the claims about what Jesus knew, how he viewed himself, what he intended to do, all of these kinds of things are both central pieces of historical method and based on a broader set of philosophical, metaphysical assumptions. And so essentially that is to say that this isn't a kind of value-neutral scientific discipline that removes us from the strictures of tradition, but is itself a kind of tradition that has a set of sort of basic assumptions across that tradition. And then the second task in this is to establish that classical Christological tradition should be considered a legitimate tradition of historical inquiry. And so this is to say that this Chalcedon and the kind of Chalcedonian tradition isn't about transforming a human figure into someone divine and removed from their historical context, someone no longer human, but also it involves thinking about humanity in ways that are being perfected by grace. And so it does sort of challenge these questions about what humanity is when we think about Jesus. That opens up a broader set of kind of metaphysical and theological questions, primarily around anthropology, that I take to be sort of the sticking points between these two traditions of historical inquiry.
Now, you've kind of already answered some of this. You engage with a number of younger scholars, and Seth Heringer being one. One of my colleagues, Jonny Rowlands, being another, and Sam Adams, and many others. And I think I might have had a couple of those already on this podcast, and I've certainly engaged with their work as well. What are the main things that set your own argument apart from theirs? Obviously, they're very different arguments, but just in broad brushstrokes, what is it that you're offering that just hasn't been touched on in the same way?
Yeah, so I think I really appreciate all three of them. I think it's interesting that a group of us young scholars around similar time, largely I think without knowing about one another, came to projects around this kind of constellation of questions. I think that's really valuable that's happening. We're all approaching it in very different ways and from different traditions, but asking some really similar questions. And so I really appreciate their work. I think it's partly interesting that it seems like most of us, developed most of our project without being aware of the others' works, and then kind of came to them late in the process. But there's been some really fruitful conversations that have come out of that, I think. But yeah, so I mean, briefly, I would say I think Seth Heringer's work is really helpful in terms of his critical take on the development of historical methods. And I think a lot of what he says is really, really spot on the kind of critical side of things. And so I appreciated that I didn't need to do all of that work once I found his work and could sort of say, I'm assuming some of these critiques in what I'm doing. But interestingly, at least in his in the thesis version and somewhat in the book, I think that Seth leans pretty heavily toward a kind of postmodern constructivist approach, and so says everyone has all of these assumptions and there is no kind of neutral approach, so we should just boldly do our own thing. That's something that I'm not sure that I'm on board with. And so my approach when we're thinking about the role of metaphysics is to say that we need some grounding for kind of rational discourse between these things that assumes that it's not simply that we all have our different paradigms and can go our different ways, but that there's a kind of common project. And so I use MacIntyre largely to frame the way that might go, thinking about how rival traditions can sort of have a genuine point of contact without slipping into relativism. And I think that's a main place where I kind of differ from Seth, though I know that he's continued to think about these things deeply and has some interesting ongoing thoughts about that. Jonny Rowlands, we were almost directly parallel in terms of our projects. So I got a hold of his basically after I'd finished mine. But I thought it was interesting because he focuses a lot more on the kind of individual thoughts of scholars. When he said he's kind of critiquing their metaphysical assumptions. And the way he talks about metaphysics often leans more toward doctrine. So things like, do you believe in the resurrection? And does that impact how you personally do this scholarship? And so my approach is rather to say, I don't think what we need is for every individual to bring a kind of totally different paradigm to this, but that we need more space within scholarship for different rival traditions of inquiry. And for people to sort of conceive of themselves as part of a tradition with metaphysical assumptions and kind of philosophical and theological ideas built into that. And so I'm in a sense taking a broader approach, I think, than Jonny in terms of how I'm conceiving of this and how I'm conceiving of metaphysics itself, probably. But again, I think I really appreciated sort of reading his stuff. And then Sam Adams maybe was the first among the group of us in what he wrote. And early on, his work was really influential for me, particularly because as I was reading it at the time, I was very Bardian, so I was very on board with what he was doing. And I think essentially my project, if his is a kind of apocalyptic critique of historical method, my project shows that I've moved from the kind of apocalyptic strand of theology more toward classical theology, and I'm doing a similar type of thing from that theological perspective. But again, I see him as a really valuable conversation partner because a lot of what I'm arguing for is that what we need to do is kind of own the traditions that we're in and think through these questions within them really well, and then bring them into dialogue. And so the more people are doing that from, different prominent traditions, the better that conversation goes, I think.
Yeah, I need to give a shout out to Jonny, of course, being my colleague. But we'll perhaps have a future discussion about the metaphysics of historical Jesus research, which is his own book. And I do need to say, I did write a review of Seth Heringer's book, and he was kind enough to write a response to that, and I put that up on my blog, and I do recommend people go and have a look at that. Now, the book is divided into two, concepts of being, concepts of knowing. So let's dive into part one, concepts of being. In your first chapter, you turn to historical Jesus scholarship, and you lay out the scholarly work that touches on the historical Jesus and particularly the divinity of Jesus as understood in historical Jesus scholarship. And you mentioned earlier on Tom Wright, and indeed that was my favorite example. And you engage with him throughout. Jesus did not know that he was God in the same way that one knows one is male or female, hungry or thirsty, and so on and so forth, is the famous quote that you take issue with. And you also address his claim couched in the language of docetism. In order to avoid doceticism, we really do need to engage in vigorous historical critical work. Can you just tell us then a little bit, what is your burden in this chapter in light of those issues? What's your burden?
Yeah, I think this chapter was my way into the project of what I was seeing when I was reading all of these different historical Jesus books and saying there's something common happening here. They're very frequently saying things like, if Jesus was human, he couldn't have X, Y, Z, right? He couldn't have known that he was God. He couldn't have believed that, or known exactly what he was supposed to do. He couldn't have, et cetera, et cetera. And knowledge was a sort of key piece throughout that for all of these scholars. And so partly I'm highlighting in this chapter just how many claims are being made by historical Jesus scholars about this kind of thing and how central those claims are to their overall arguments. And then showing that those claims, again, are not neutral, that they're built on assumptions about human nature and even built on Christological assumptions. And so that's the other thing I do in the chapter, is to say, frequently, the theological sort of defense for doing historical Jesus work is that if we don't want to be docetic, and right, docetists are those who say that Jesus only appeared to be human. If we want to say Jesus was truly human, then we need to do historical Jesus studies. And so I think that's interesting, because obviously you could just have historians saying, because we care about this as academics, we're going to do it. But they're saying Christians should care about what we say, and Christians should build their theology on what we say, because otherwise they're docetic. So that is a much stronger claim, and that's the one that I take issue with, because I essentially say the way that they're conceiving of docetism is not actually docetism. It's a different claim they're making, and one that is not considered a heresy according to classical Christology. And essentially the root of that I kind of raise is the metaphysical assumptions about how they think about Christology. So, for example, they usually seem to have a very competitive paradigm in mind between divine and human action, such that to see Jesus as human is to see him not as divine, right? And so those are sort of set up in competition with one another. And when they say we don't want to be docetic, what they mean is we don't want to talk about Jesus in any divine terms. He needs to be just human, just like we are. And so I think that chapter really enables me to set up, this is widespread. It's common across authors who are otherwise very different from each other. And it has these deep assumptions, both philosophical and theological, that we actually need to dig into. So that kind of sets up then the rest of the book.
I want to pick up on a little phrase there, the non-competitive relationship, and just dig into that a little bit, because you argue, and I'm quoting you here, if we want to make sense of Jesus as a historical figure, we require a conception of being that accounts for the radically non-competitive relationship that exists between the finite and the infinite, between creator and creature. And this then leads you into your metaphysics of participation. Could you unpack this for us?
Yeah, so I have a chapter on kind of a metaphysics of participation. I know that this is a kind of big discussion in a lot of different areas, a lot of different approaches these days. My perspective is that the metaphysics of participation is the philosophical outworking of the doctrine of creation from nothing. And the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is one of the kind of earliest doctrines that we get solidified in the Christian tradition. So I think it's one of the basically foundational Christian belief. And so over time, what we get is this philosophical sort of language for understanding the implications of that. And at its most basic, what the doctrine of participation says is that God is being itself, and that creatures are composed of essence and being, meaning that we receive being from God by participation, because we can't account for our own being on our own, right? Our essence doesn't include being within what it is, rather we are created. And what's really significant about this is that it forces us to realize that when we say that we're created, we mean that God is present to us always, moment by moment, sustaining us in being, which means that his very presence to us and action in us is the ground of our own being and action. And so it can't exist in competition with our being in action, because if were he to remove himself from us, we would not become more free, we would cease to exist altogether. And so I think that this is a kind of foundational piece for how we might begin to conceive of divine and human action and being. And essentially, the main thing most easily does is help us push back against people who think of God as, some big being that exists in the universe, who acts instead of us, who acts in place of us, who displaces our own sort of existence and action through his own, which is frequently how people speak when they do Christology. And so they're thinking, was this Jesus' divinity, or was it his humanity? Was he divine, or was he human? And so Christology is the place where I think this kind of metaphysic really comes to bear, and you can sort of draw out the implications most fully. But this also, I think, has similarly deep implications for basically everything else we want to say theologically. And so I outline Aquinas' particular approach to this, which does have some unique things that he adds, but also I think is in many ways faithful to much of the patristic tradition that he's drawing on. And that's really the goal, is to sort of see Aquinas as a representative of a more ancient tradition of thought, sort of adding some specificity to that.
Now, before I continue this line of thought, it may be worthwhile just panning out again, because it does occur to me that there'll be many who read the title, The Consciousness of the Historical Jesus, and expect the table of contents to involve critical exegetical analysis of the synoptics and the relationship between the Johannine tradition and so on and so forth. And already from our discussion, it's going to be clear that there's a lot of theological and metaphysical work being undertaken here. But you're not saying that theology should trump all of that historical critical stuff. So maybe just briefly, before we continue the line of thought, what are you saying then? If theology isn't trumping history or historical critical work, what are you doing?
I think I really appreciate this question, because I do think that's a common assumption when people sort of first see the project. And what I'm doing is two things, which is to say, historical critical work in itself is not the only way to do detailed historical biblical exegesis, right? It's a particular method and approach, I say a particular tradition of doing that work. And I want to show the ways in which it's not a scientific discipline, but is precisely that kind of tradition of doing that kind of work. And so a lot of the kind of metaphysical work that you see in the book is me engaging with the methods, with the approaches to show that. And then also to say, one thing I offer in the book is, I think, a better theological argument than N.T. Wright's argument. If we don't want to be docetic, we just need to do historical Jesus studies. I think I give a detailed Christological argument for why we need to do historical study of the Gospels. And so grounding this in the ancient beliefs of Christians and saying, we do believe these things about Jesus, and therefore we need to do this work and we need to do it well. But I'm not saying, because we believe this about Jesus, therefore we need to just take whatever the historical Jesus scholars have given us and build our theology on that. So I'm trying to draw that distinction and say we really need to do critical historical work, but critical historical work should look different, or at least should look like more things than what it's looked like up till now. What we need to do is take account of history, but not let the metaphysical assumptions of the discipline of historical Jesus studies to control the theology of Christians.
Yeah, I think you do an excellent job in laying that out. And I do hope that my colleagues in the Guild of New Testament Scholarship, where they're primarily located, would read your argument here. Now, back to the line of thought. In your first section, you go to the doctrine of the incarnation. And you use the language of metaphysical baggage, I think, just now, to talk about involved in historical Jesus work. And what you're doing, of course, is, as you just said, giving us a robust Christological and theological account of what is going on. And one of the words that you do spend a lot of time meditating on is the use of the word person, and how this is played into contemporary scholarship. What are the correctives you offer there? What are your key advances?
Yeah, I think the discussion of personhood is something that came out of both reading a lot of historical Jesus scholarship and, kind of the deep study of especially contemporary Christology, and just realizing that constantly where people were going with their Christology was the assumption that Jesus is a human person with a divine consciousness. That was sort of underlying this assumption. People explicitly talk in those terms quite often and say that that's what Chalcedon teaches. And in other places it comes up very implicitly. But I realized I think this is a huge problem, because that's clearly not what Chalcedon is talking about. I don't do an exhaustive kind of genealogy of the philosophy of personhood, but I do trace these changes to say this is what personhood meant to most ancient theologians, and then how does that change in the modern period, and so particularly following Locke, and then thinking about the development of the idea of personhood as consciousness, And what we get there is this change. So in the modern period, the early modern period, most of the philosophers are nominalists. So they're no longer thinking about persons in terms of substance. And so instead, they're thinking of it in terms of continuity of consciousness. So this idea that a person is this sort of ongoing conscious experience of identity. And as interesting as that is, I then kind of show that how that changes what the claim is being made about Christology if we then assume that is all that personhood is. And I think importantly within that is to say that Locke also recognizes that concept of personhood can't account for everything we usually think about when we think about personhood, right? And so he's aware that these broader philosophical, metaphysical questions about substance are kind of being left to the side, and essentially he thinks his view could fit with a variety of claims on that level, but that the claims on that level often sort of drop out of the discussion. And so what we end up with is people saying, well, Jesus is one person in two natures, meaning he's a human nature with a divine consciousness. And so what that does is it both undermines Jesus' humanity, because now he no longer has a human consciousness, so he's partially human. But it also, I think, it radically undermines what it means to say that the identity of Christ is the eternal Son of God. And so I really push and say we're making both a more radical claim in the classical tradition and one that preserves Jesus' humanity much more fully than what these Christologies do. And I think that trajectory of Christology, thinking of personhood in terms of consciousness, is a lot of what then is having trouble with historical Jesus studies. So when historical Jesus scholars say classical Christology makes it impossible to do historical work, I think that's the Christology that they more have in mind, which is actually a very modernist thing. It's not the kind of ancient Christology of the Chalcedonian tradition.
Superbly put. I'm going to read out a passage that I underlined on page 70 that I think sums up some of your arguments here. You write that unity at the level of hypostasis and act of being are both far grander claims than can be grasped by the concept of consciousness. The transcendent mystery of the divine hypostasis, constituted through subsistent relations, giving a specificity to the eternal act of being of the Word, proceeding from the Father in the eternal unity of the triune Godhead, hypostatically united to a human nature in the Incarnation, is otherwise reduced to a strikingly mundane conception of a precognitive awareness of mental acts. Now, that's a slightly overloaded sentence, and I'm sure that not everybody followed all of that. But obviously, go get the book, and read it to understand it. But I thought you did a terrific job in laying out your positive case as well as the critical one. Now, obviously, a lot of what you've been saying and your own biography and your theological journey, you've spoken of Aquinas quite a bit, and you're deploying Aquinas' Christology in dialogue with numerous modern scholars. I was really impressed with your breadth of learning and how you navigate all of these locuses, these schools of learning. It's quite an achievement, and this really sets the scene for part 2 of your book. Let me just ask you one question off the back. Did anything surprise you in the process of researching your argument and engaging with Aquinas in light of all of these issues?
Yeah, I honestly, that chapter where I kind of outline Aquinas' Christology, I was reaching a point where I was like, okay, I need to, in some ways, just need to outline what his Christology is in this chapter, even though that's been done many times in many books. And so I was really looking for a creative way that I could do that would add something to the conversation. And this was in the middle of COVID lockdown. So it was just me at a desk for, endless days on end thinking. And in the midst of that, I realized that Aquinas had already outlined, I think, what I see the major strands of modern Christology are. And so he has this list of modes of accidental union, ways of conceiving of Christology in terms of accidental rather than substantial union, which he says results in Nestorianism. And I was honestly just very struck by, so this wasn't kind of a contrived thing that I do in the chapter. I just realized, all of these, Christologies that I've been reading for a long time and engaged with in a variety of ways, Aquinas already listed all of them right here on this page. That's really, really striking to me, and I hadn't seen other people necessarily looking at it in that way. So that became my way into, outlining what Aquinas is doing in dialogue with all these different approaches, which I think enables it to be a kind of constructive offer to contemporary Christology, not just a otherwise maybe boring chapter of a PhD thesis. And so I really liked that section because I was really struck. I was surprised by that. One of the things I love about Aquinas is because he's received such a robust and coherent, though not monolithic, tradition, he's able to be so detailed and work things out in so many ways that you often find that he's already said things that in modern scholarship has taken a long time to kind of get to. And so this was one of those that I was sort of, really happily surprised to find in him. The challenge of that kind of thing is it's not always helpful to translate what a modern scholar is doing into scholastic terms. And I think that can be a kind of reductive thing to do. And so I certainly don't mean to say that, these things stand or fall based on how they translate into Aquinas' own terms, but that it reveals a lot about them for a common dialogue if you can translate them clearly into kind of scholastic terms and say, this is what I think they're claiming. And so from a Thomistic perspective, this would be problematic for this reason or for this reason, but also then how does it hold up in their own kind of framework from what they're trying to do? And so I do try to offer that. So one thing I say is a lot of modern Christologies claim to be able to account for a much broader range of sort of desires and intentions in what they're doing, whereas they see the classical tradition as too restrictive. And so in each of these, I show that actually I think Aquinas' approach can account for most of the positive aims of what they're doing, whereas they are the ones who are rejecting the positive aims of what he's doing. And so that, again, brings us back to that Macantirian thing, where one ways that rival traditions can have genuine constructive conversation is we can point out how some of the arguments of a rival tradition fall short of their own kind of premises and goals. So that's kind of the aim of that chapter, which enables me to bring in quite a number of different interesting dialogue partners.
Yeah, indeed. A number of interesting dialogue partners. There was a lot of energy, I think, in that chapter. I think it's probably the longest in the book.
Yeah, I think that is probably right.
Well, I'd love to jump into our quick fire round. Now, are you you know what we do with these, right? So I didn't send you anything in advance. I'm just going to throw some random questions at you and just see where it goes.
Sounds good.
I deliberately I'm reining myself in. I'm trying to be more sensible, you see. I'm getting to an age now where I think it's time to grow up. And so here, what is your favorite, the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Matthew?
Great question. I think the Gospel of John, in part because by accident, it's the one that I've ended up being able to study the most, and with some amazing scholars, and so I just have wonderful memories of that. And then also because it gets left out of historical Jesus scholarship, I have a soft spot for it.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I'll unleash Michael Barber on you when we're at SBLAAR next year. We finished our podcast with him a few weeks ago on his book, dealing with Matthew. One thing about you that you think will surprise our listeners?
I guess it depends on who's listening. Let's see. One thing would be that I was a musician before I got into theology. That won't be surprising to people who knew me before I went off and did this. But that was kind of everything I did was known for was my doing music. And so, but I haven't done much music at all since I went to grad school for theology for a variety of reasons. So I feel like I've lived a couple of different lives.
Yeah, understood. Now, as we've already mentioned Aquinas quite a few times, huge influence on your own thinking. Do you think you would have personally gotten on with Aquinas? Or, just would you rather hang out with a different theologian?
I tend to think that I would have gotten on with Aquinas. This is difficult because I think there's a lot of myths around Aquinas from how people think about who he was, and some of those are from people that didn't like him that have sort of popularized some of these myths, I think. But my sense is that he's someone who I probably would find intimidating in person, given his sort of wisdom. And, he is sort of said to have been relatively quiet until he spoke, and then everyone very much listened. And I really value people like that. Yeah, I certainly think he's probably a very different person from me in many ways. So I personally would love to know Aquinas, and I've gained a great deal from him. But he would probably be very foreign to me in many ways.
For sure. I must mention, by the way, Thomas Aquinas and Karl Barth, A New Conversation by Jeffrey Scaff. Fascinating study. Bit of a footnote. Last one. New Testament scholar that has impacted you the most?
It's maybe a toss-up between Richard Bauckham. I knew him in Cambridge, and so we had a lot of conversations, and his work really influenced me. But it probably is N.T. Wright. I read basically all of his kind of major published works during my master's, and was very, very influenced by him. For a while, I was the kind of person early on that would, N.T. Wright can't be wrong about anything. And then I thought, I want to be a scholar. Surely I can find something wrong with him. And then everything since has been sort of, critiquing what he's doing. But I think either way that has had an indelible impact on my thinking.
Well, let's turn to part 2 of the book, Concepts of Knowing. In your 4th chapter, the intelligibility of participated being, you argue, and I'm just going to quote from page 99, you argue the following. Despite cursory discussion of critical realism among certain historical Jesus scholars, the nature of historical knowledge as knowledge has not been adequately scrutinized, in particular in relation to questions of cognitive theory, which, as we will see, helpfully connect the relevant epistemological issues more directly to metaphysics. And this raises, I think, huge questions that go beyond the focus of your own work. But can you tell us in brief what you think are the main issues on the table at this point and how you work with them?
So the question of cognitive theory is one that I knew that I needed to deal with somewhat, but originally hadn't expected to be such a big part of this project. And it was part because I came across, so Daniel DeHaan is a scholar who is in Oxford now. He was in Cambridge as a postdoc when I was there. And this is one of his areas of expertise. And talking with him, I became increasingly aware that this was a massive question in the background of what I was doing. And I became aware that there's a lot of scholarship today that is in discussion around sort of epistemology and neuroscience. There's all these kind of different questions that circle this, and that most of them have become unmoored from what was classically also an ontological question, which is cognitive theory. So thinking about sort of the powers of the intellect and rationality, and how those connect then to sort of our embodied organs and our experience of knowledge and the validity of knowledge, right? All these different kinds of questions sometimes get muddled together, and in kind of post-Kantian philosophy often are completely unmoored from the ontological basis. And so I realized if we're going to talk about metaphysics, then this actually is hugely important. And so I'm engaging in this chapter with kind of ongoing work, which is kind of continuing to develop and deepen. I would love for a follow-up project to engage with these broader questions that you mentioned of how does this impact kind of historiography, historical knowledge in general. Partly, there's a couple of scholars that I'm genuinely waiting on them to publish their books before I could write that book. So that's sort of maybe the status of this right now. But I think part of the point of that is to say that if we think in terms of cognitive theory, then we can more directly connect questions about the nature of knowledge to questions about the nature of being. And that doesn't mean that we sort of read an epistemology straight off of our metaphysics, but that there is a kind of meaningful connection between those two questions, and that is really significant. And so that in part allows me to say, right, that these assumptions about knowledge that historical Jesus scholars have, then they say, this is just how human knowing works. therefore this is what Jesus thought, that is coming from not only a certain epistemology, but also an underlying metaphysic. Whether they're aware of that or not, whether they engage with metaphysics or not. And again, I think that this is maybe one of the most important sort of enduring influences of idealism on modern historical method, which we're well aware that these historical methods were developed by idealist scholars. And they were much more explicit about that in the past than scholars are today. And so I think Seth Heringer deals well with some of those kinds of questions, but I take that in a much more ontological, metaphysical direction. And then the other thing that I do with that discussion is to say, so I outline Aquinas' cognitive theory, talk about the various powers of the soul, the ways in which we sort of take in sense perception and cognize that, and how that works for Aquinas, which both goes into kind of deep questions about philosophical anthropology, what are humans, but also that sort of provides the raw material out of which his doctrine of Jesus' knowledge is built. So when he's making claims about what Jesus did or didn't know or how he knew, he's using those very precise philosophical terms drawn from his cognitive theory about how humans know to unpack that. And I think oftentimes people have a hard time understanding Aquinas' arguments on this score because they don't know his cognitive theory. And so they can't make sense of the kinds of claims that he's making. And so that was a part of the burden in this book, was to say, well, if I can help us all understand his cognitive theory well, then we can see how that plays out in his Christology. And again, in part to say, even if you don't buy his cognitive theory, you need to have answers to these questions in order to make these kinds of claims, right? And that they're never going to be neutral. And so that's sort of ultimately what I'm after in that discussion.
So you've already begun speaking about this, Aquinas' cognitive psychology. Maybe you could just, in a nutshell, what is Aquinas' cognitive psychology? And perhaps for those who are going to be a little bit skeptical, why should we bother with Aquinas' cognitive psychology? Maybe you can address that concern, which of course you do in the book.
Absolutely. I think, without getting too complicated, Aquinas is interested in the ways in which we come to know things. And so he thinks broadly the idea that nothing is in the intellect that is not first in the senses. So what does it mean for us to sort of come to know things about the world around us? And in some ways, this is unpacking the kind of critical realism would be the epistemology attached to this, but it's really giving an ontology that underlies that. And so, right, he's thinking about the ways in which we have our kind of external senses, we experience the world, those bring information to these internal senses, which track this sort of temporal order of the things that allow us to sort of combine what we hear, what we see, what we taste, that sort of thing, to make kind of limited judgments about those things, and then also to kind of abstract what we'd say the forms of the things, right? So this is the sort of common forms of things. And so you can see the connection with kind of ancient discussions of knowledge here, this idea that there's a common form to certain things in the world, and that we essentially make genuine contact with those things when we come to know them, but that we also have this kind of hierarchy of powers inside of us that makes sense of those things in ways that are particular to who we are. And so this is, I think, a really key thing, is to say that it's not as if I sort of go around zapping things in the world with, my agent intellect, and therefore I know the forms of all the things in my mind, but that through experiencing the world, I come to more and more grasp something kind of universal to the things that I understand, something common across the things that I experience, in a way that allows me sort of intellectually to engage with those things, but that is always going to be formed and shaped by my experience of them. So there's a kind of universality to knowledge, but it's always in conversation with a particularity of knowing. And that this isn't just an epistemological claim, but it's a claim about sort of what humans are and how they work ontologically. And that's connected even to sort of being and what being ultimately is, right? And so you can see, one of the things I say is it's not surprising that belief in a kind of realism drops out alongside belief in God in the modern period. Because I do think that the doctrine of creation adds a sort of further foundation to a kind of belief in realism. And these things kind of go together, right? The fact that the God who created these things also created our cognitive capacity to know them. And again, that's not in just a reductive, like, okay, therefore we know everything, that's easy. But it sort of lends weight to, I think, the strength of this kind of approach. And so this is really key in a few ways, because on the one hand, we're going to think in our Christology about how Jesus could know kind of universal things or kind of supernatural modes, have supernatural kind of modes of knowledge, but also the ways in which those are going to be then grounded in his particularity of his kind of cultural location. And so particularly from his kind of acquired knowledge, to say that his own experiences, his own language, his own culture are going to be the sort of framework within which he both thinks and speaks. And that is a big reason why we need to do historical research. So it's kind of jumping ahead to the next chapter, but I think it's part of why this kind of cognitive theory is really essential. And this differs from, I think, someone like N.T. Wright's critical realism. So he gets that you need to deal with some of this, at least on the epistemological level. But by critical realism, he doesn't mean metaphysical realism. And so his critical realism is pretty close to an idealism, because he means the reality of the space-time universe outside my mind in a kind of Kantian way. And so I'm pushing this further and saying we need actually an ontological realism to say that there are such things as substances and forms that we can know, that we have some contact with. And so I think that's a kind of deeper philosophical claim that underpins the whole rest of the book, which has to do with why we need to talk about metaphysics in the first place.
Brilliant. I must say one of the footnotes that I came across in this section was a lot of fun. I don't know if it occurred to you when you were writing this, but an author on anthropology and cognitive theory and called David Brain. I thought that was funny. Maybe we can turn then to that chapter 5 that you've already alluded to. It's really an extended excursus, right, on Mark 13:32, famously, concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Obviously, this is well-trodden ground because the argument goes Jesus is ignorant, and therefore, because God is omniscient, Jesus isn't God, and so on. In a nutshell, what are your arguments? How do you address this text, given how you've now set things up with Aquinas's cognitive thinking?
So this is a text that looms extremely large in so much scholarship. Historical Jesus scholars talk about it all the time. Often critics of both Chalcedon and Christianity in general use this text massively. And so I always figured it would be something worth addressing. And this actually is probably the chapter that took me the longest to write, because I deal with so much patristic literature throughout it. And so sort of parsing through all of that was something that was kind of ongoing for a number of years in this project. And so I start by saying there's kind of two Christological principles that impact how we might think about this from a Chalcedonian perspective. First is to say that knowledge only belongs to a person by reason of their nature. So we can't attribute knowledge to the hypostatic union itself, to the sort of person of the Son, but that Christ has knowledge in each of his natures. So I think that's a sort of beginning point that, and again, that goes back to this idea of what is a person, what is a nature, which I've dealt with in detail before this. But knowledge is going to be an aspect of a nature. So we have to say that Christ has a twofold knowledge if he has two natures, but that we need a kind of correspondence between these two knowledges. So we can't conceive of Jesus being omniscient in his divinity and ignorant in his humanity and still being one person. In order for him to sort of act meaningfully as one person, and again, there's a lot of Christology underlying how this works. We need some sort of correspondence between those two. But the other piece of this is that given the doctrine of divine simplicity, which is, I think, axiomatic for the Chalcedonian tradition, that entails that if Jesus was fully God, then he did have divine knowledge. He's fully omniscient, but only in his divinity. And his humanity can't possess divine knowledge as such. So what we need to think about is how his humanity might possess human forms of supernatural knowledge. So divine knowledge communicated in a human mode. And the modus principle comes up a lot from Aquinas. The received is in the receiver according to the mode of the receiver. So we're thinking about how Jesus might receive knowledge from God in a human mode. And those are going to underlie then how we think about this text. And so the first thing to say is that when the question of whether the Son knows the day or the hour in this context, I think is very clearly a question of whether Jesus in his humanity knows the day or the hour. He's not talking theoretically about his divine knowledge, in eternity. I think just contextually that twists this passage quite far. Jesus doesn't ever really speak hypothetically about his kind of substantial being. Rather, he's speaking as a human, and so he's talking about his human knowledge. And I think that if we frame it in that way, then the question becomes, is it a problem if he doesn't know the day or the hour in his humanity? Is there a sense in which he does know it? And so I follow Aquinas here in saying what we might want to say if we want to affirm the patristic tradition, which pretty universally says Jesus does in some sense know the day and the hour. What we might mean by that is if he possesses the beatific vision, which comes later in the book, but I sort of preview it here. If he has the vision of God, which I argue that he does, then he might have in a kind of like an inchoate, inexpressible, apocalyptic vision in which he would know the day or the hour, but not in a way that he necessarily can communicate or would communicate. And so when he says that the Son doesn't know the day or the hour, I sort of say this is kind of like if your kids, ask you the solution to a really complex math equation and you technically could solve it, but you say, I don't know. That might be kind of what we could imagine Jesus saying here without, so he technically does or has access to this knowledge, but he doesn't know it. He's not lying. But I also push this further and say, Aquinas also acknowledges that Jesus in his humanity doesn't comprehend the divine essence, so he doesn't know everything. And I think that is really significant because then we could say, maybe this is something that he doesn't know in his human knowledge, and that still doesn't undermine his divine identity, to my mind. And so that sort of pushes us away from the patristic tradition a bit, which Aquinas wouldn't want to do. But as far as the kind of Christological question, I think that it actually isn't a huge problem to say maybe this is one of those things. And even just recognizing that like this kind of apocalyptic knowledge of the future is not like a normal element of knowledge. And so if that's not something that's communicated to Christ in his humanity, I don't see that personally raising very big problems.
Now, you mentioned acquired knowledge there, as that's part of your argument. In the next chapter, you get into Aquinas' account of acquired or empiric knowledge to help you detail an understanding of the identity of Jesus. But I wanted to jump over to the chapter 7, which is on prophetic knowledge. What difference does a theological conception of prophecy make for our historical understanding of Jesus, which is a burden in this chapter? You've got twofold argument. Perhaps you could walk us through that.
Absolutely. So I think in historical Jesus scholarship, Jesus is most often spoken of as a prophet of some kind, right? So this is very kind of standard, is to see Jesus as a kind of prophet. And yet the assumption is that he doesn't have prophetic knowledge. So he acts like a prophet, but most arguments are built on the idea that prophecy obviously isn't a thing. And so to say, if we have a theological conception of what prophecy is, and if we think that prophecy might be possible, then I argue that's actually going to change our vision of what we mean by Jesus as a prophet. And so I kind of unpack how prophetic knowledge works in Aquinas' view, again, connecting this to his cognitive theory, to say that this isn't a form of knowledge that is unhuman. That's part of the point here, is that this is our sort of intellect. In his view, our intellect is designed such that this is part of how it's supposed to work, or can work by grace. So this is how grace might perfect nature. And he talks about how this fits in with the sort of vocation of a prophet, I think is a really significant thing. One thing that's really important about this is that the prophet isn't someone who sort of just knows all things in a way that kind of he's constantly thinking about random facts that are irrelevant or whatever. That's not kind of the vision here. So this is very much contextual. The prophet is given knowledge for a particular purpose. And so again, we're not making him this ghostly, otherworldly figure here, but rather seeing this contextualized within his sort of incarnate mission. And then I think this connects really well with the kind of the vision of him as an eschatological prophet, which is going to point us partly to the beatific vision, but also to recognize that some of the conundrums that get raised about Jesus as an eschatological prophet, I think can partly be solved by a better understanding of prophecy. So I talk about this idea that Jesus kind of predicts the end of the world and then it doesn't come, and therefore he's sort of a failed prophet, this kind of originally kind of Schweitzer view that gets picked up. And here I'm following mostly Simon Gain in a kind of discussion along with an Oxford group that looked at this from an exegetical and theological sort of angle. But one of the things they take away from this is that prophecy is always for a reason. So, for example, you could say, if Jesus did predict something with the assumption that the people would continue to respond to him the way that they were, and then they stopped responding to him the way that they were, and then that thing didn't come to pass, that would be how prophecy actually typically functions in the Old Testament. And so that might not itself be a big problem. Though, of course, underlying this is the sense that Aquinas would say that those passages are typically referring, when he says, you will see the kingdom come in glory, are referring to the transfiguration in the next chapter. And a lot of historical Jesus scholars don't read it that way because they don't think the transfiguration happened. So again, you can see the kind of underlying how this shifts how we understand Jesus. But then it also, I think, points us to this question of the knowledge of hearts. So Jesus is sort of depicted as knowing what's in the hearts of others in the Gospels. And this is somewhat of an original argument that I make, which is that I think that for Aquinas, the knowledge of hearts is not prophetic knowledge, but rather comes from the beatific vision. And so this is partly getting into the weeds of some inter-Thomistic arguments that maybe not that many people will care deeply about, but those of us who are in these conversations really love. But I think it's a really interesting one because actually in Scripture, as Colin Blake Bullard argues, in Scripture, the only one who knows what's in the hearts of others is God. And that's different from the kind of intuition about we sometimes get prophets who have a sense of, this person's lying or something like that, but they don't have direct access to what's in the heart of another the way that Jesus does. And so I do think that the direct parallel to that in the Old Testament is God's own knowledge of what's in the heart. And that therefore that's not something that's ever given to the prophets. And so that means that we need another category of knowledge, of human knowledge, when we're thinking about Jesus. And so this points us to this kind of apocalyptic vision of God that Aquinas argues that Jesus possesses, that it's only in the beatific vision, the direct vision of God, that Jesus then could see what is in the hearts of others in a way that transcends anything that the prophets are ever given knowledge of.
Wonderful. And that's really takes us nicely into chapter 8, which is all about the beatific vision. Now, I'm guessing, it's just a hunch, but I'm guessing that there'll be some listening wondering, what is the beatific vision? And I've got to say, I do think this is, you make some beautiful claims in this chapter. But maybe first you could just briefly, what is the beatific vision for those who might be a little bit confused?
Yes, of course. So in many ways, the beatific vision is kind of the heart of much classical eschatology. If you look at a lot of the ancient church and the medieval church, they're not thinking so much about the end times, or even necessarily a ton about heaven, though sometimes, but rather they're thinking about the very heart of our telos, or the ultimate promise given us in Scripture, which is, for now we see in a mirror dimly, Paul says, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. Right? So in 1 John, we read, when he is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. And so this promise that we will see God in the life to come is taken to be the kind of heart of our ultimate end as humans. And it's referred to as the beatific vision, the happy-making, beatifying vision. So the vision of God, the thing that will ultimately fulfill us. And I think this is a really profound doctrine in many ways, in part because it allows us to consistently say that God is our end, or our telos as humans. And so whatever else might attend the life to come, whatever wonderful things are in the new heavens and the new earth and all of that, those things aren't what ultimately fulfill us. It's God who fulfills us. And then whatever is wonderful about that participates in the kind of blessedness that comes from God. And so I think this is really at the heart of the Christian vision is, right, it's life now isn't limited, isn't unsatisfying because we don't have enough of the good things here. If only we had more ice cream or nicer cars or whatever, then we would be ultimately fulfilled. But actually, it's God alone that fulfills us. And so I think this is as kind of a profound vision of creation and of human nature that's at the heart of classical eschatology. And I think it has pretty radical implications as the sort of center point of Christian teleology.
Yeah, thanks for reminding us of that important truth, indeed. Now, you write towards the end of this chapter, I think it summarizes quite nicely what you argue in the chapter, that the affirmation of Christ's possession of the beatific vision upholds the unity of his personhood without undermining the integrity of his human nature, because it flows from the hypostatic union as a work of the Holy Spirit. The beatific vision preserves the historical human life of Christ without undermining his divine personhood. It also creates continuity, you point out, between Jesus and the apocalyptic figures that preceded him, placing him firmly within his Jewish context. Maybe now some will start to see how your argument is layered and take step by step, acquired knowledge, prophetic knowledge, beatific vision. Which leads us to the conclusion. I'd love to hear, just very briefly, what you think are your most important conclusions. First for the academy, for the scholarly world, and then for the church.
Yeah, I think one thing in writing this that was interesting was I was really hesitant to be too prescriptive in the conclusions, because I felt like I would really hope that this just opens up a lot of conversations for people and that they feel free to take those in whatever direction they want to take them. And depending on the tradition they're coming from, that's going to look really different. So I don't want to sort of foreclose that by saying this is what all of this means for you. And also, I'm not qualified to decide all of that, right? I'm not a historical Jesus scholar or even a New Testament scholar, really. And I have more expertise in the secondary scholarship on the historical Jesus than I do expertise in doing, the primary work on the Gospels themselves, as it were. So the first thing that I want to say is, I really tried to leave this as open as possible, though I was obviously pushed by both examiners and publishers to say as much as I could in the conclusion of what I think the kind of takeaway is. And I think, the main thing is to say that I think that New Testament scholars in general, and especially historical Jesus scholars, need to think on this level. So this sort of basic post-Kantian assumption that we can ignore metaphysics, I hope that they will start to see the problems with that. I hope that they will re-engage with metaphysical assumptions, particularly when it comes to philosophical anthropology, and to do much more kind of theorizing what are humans, what is knowledge, rather than just making these kinds of claims. And that might just mean that they make less of these kinds of claims, and that would certainly be a good start, right? Stop saying Jesus didn't know this or can't have known that, unless they're going to, back that up with a good argument. But also to say, that so hopefully this will allow them to sort of strengthen the tradition that they're a part of, the tradition of historical inquiry that they inhabit, and also then engage more constructively with philosophers and theologians about these kinds of questions. So that's a good way into, right, bringing these disciplines in closer contact, is seeing actually the discipline of theology has a lot of resources that might be useful to you in sort of theorizing these kinds of questions so that you can be more consistent and honest about the assumptions going into this task. So I think that's a kind of big takeaway for the academy. And that part of what that means then is that ideally the academy has more open space for people from rival traditions here to enter in and to be considered, full members of the academy doing that work and enter into dialogue. And that means a couple of things, right? So, if the assumption, which I don't know how much this is the case, but sometimes people talk like, oh, in the academy, it's only secular scholarship, or it's only people critical of kind of Christian beliefs that count as critical scholars. And that may be true in some places, but I think just recognizing that when and where that's the case, there's something really dishonest and unscholarly happening there. And not just because we're saying, well, we as Christians have different beliefs from you, but actually you need to make arguments for these things. You need to make scholarly arguments for them. But also to say that when Christians do this work, or people, part of a religious tradition, whatever kind of tradition they're a part of, that they shouldn't just then recede into their own kind of ghettos and do their own thing, only talking to people with the same assumptions. So that, again, to say it's important that you work within the tradition that you're a part of, but do it so that you can have a common dialogue across these traditions, and offer it up in that way. And so I think that one thing that will look like is that ideally these scholars talk less as if they're scientists, and more as if they're, kind of historian, philosopher, theologians who are doing a kind of humanities discipline. And I think that would be much more fruitful, right? And to say that these are contestable, highly, highly contestable suggestions that we're making to a common project. These are not scientific reconstructions of the past. So I think ideally we could move in that direction. And then I think for the church to say that, one thing that I found unsettling early on that really led me to this project was that in a lot of the circles I was in, theologians were starting to reject the classical tradition and try to follow the conclusions of historical Jesus scholarship and construct a theology on that. And I could see that was not going to be fruitful in so many ways. And so what I'm hoping is that I've opened up a space for them to see the deep value of this classical tradition. And again, not as a monolith, but as a sort of ongoing discussion and debate about Jesus. And also see it as something that doesn't foreclose the possibility of genuine critical engagement with history, but rather opens it up, enables it, and necessitates it. And so, for the church in particular, I want to say both, own your deep roots in your tradition, and please engage deeply with history, and that those both entail and necessitate one another. So that's kind of what I'm after in this book.
That's wonderful. Now, maybe just last question. What's next for you?
It's a great question. It's still a little bit up in the air. I'm currently teaching a lot, and so more slowly developing what a next research project would be. I'm currently working on actually a project on the theological virtues, but I would love a follow-up book to this about historiography in general, thinking about historiography and metaphysics more broadly. That's kind of my dream for the next project. So hopefully that will be in the works before too long.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Austin. You've been listening to Chris Tilling and Austin Stevenson discussing the consciousness of the historical Jesus, and I think we've been given much to ponder. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will see you in the next.
You've been listening to On Script, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.